Okay, thank you guys for coming down for our first meeting with Andrew. And I thought today we would just kind of get a feel for how you would like this committee to work. I suggested for Andrew to give me some suggestions. And so we're going to talk about a couple of those things that he and I discussed. But going forward, I'd like your input on what you would since we put the financials on the consent agenda, kind of like you to tell me and Andrew what you'd like to see going forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mary. I appreciate you reaching out. Yeah, so I think this is really meant to be what you guys want it to be. And so wherever you guys drive us on some of these topics. And so initially tonight we'll go over some of the February financials, and you guys are fully aware of kind of what those look like, but I wanted to just talk through some of those points. And again, whether you guys have questions, ask those. Hopefully going forward to some degree, we can, I'll say preemptively provide financials for the regular sessions. But we normally don't get the financials until another 7 to 10 days from now. And so that's why we can't present March at this point. But anyway, it'll be good to go through the February, talk about kind of what's going on a little more in depth and some of that stuff. And then also I have a presentation on bond and debt overview. And so kind of how we go through the process, what does our debt look like? What does general municipality debt look like? And kind of take it from there, because again, whether it be because of these large projects that we're talking about, whether it just be, T&D projects that we have in general and what that might look like. So we may look at furtherance of debt, later this year or early next year, depending on the avenues that we go. And so I want to make sure everybody understands what that looks like, why we do it, the value of that, those type of things. And so we'll talk about that as well. But
This is the acronym T&D.
Transmission and distribution. Yep.
And I think probably that Stevie's not gone through the whole process, or Brett, of going before the UG to ask when we need to incur debt. So I thought that would.
One of the goals Andrew certainly had, and we had
Right.
for the different committees, is how do we give you the update too, but also sort of bring you up to speed or like a refresher educational opportunity while we're doing the updates as well.
Yeah, so we'll get into it, but we haven't issued debt since 2020. And so it's been several years.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that we'll talk through and
Oh, then Rose probably hasn't been through it either.
yeah, and it's a unique process a little bit. And so it requires more interaction with the unified government, different things like that. So we all have to be on the same page with what that looks like and make sure that everybody feels there's value in that activity. So we'll get to that. So just stepping into the February financials a little bit on the first slide. Next slide, please. So just going into this a little bit, this is the billed kilowatt hours. So again, this is the, sorry, one back. Sorry about that. No problem. This is the electric side, right? So this is volume on the electric side, year to date in February, so just the 2 months. So the volume's down about 1.4% overall. Residential is up 5%. That's generally due to the higher heating load, because we did have a colder winter, more snow, that type of thing. Commercial was flat overall. Industrial is down about 11%. The industrial is really driven largely by General Motors, which is down about 35% year to date. And industrial is really lumpy. When I say lumpy, it's because we have very few customers in those classes, right? So the residential class, we have about 62,000 residential customers, thereabouts. On the commercial side, we have about 6,900 customers, whereas industrial, we only have about 80 customers. So it's much more lumpy. So one customer can move that to a much greater extent. And then General Motors being the largest in that class really drives most of that volume. Next slide, please. So on the water side.
Is KU considered industrial or are they?
It is
they commercial?
So it's really anybody that makes something. So if you produce a good,
Okay.
that would generally be considered industrial. So it's not really by size so much. It's really by what you do, what action you take. So on the water side, for year to date through February. Residential's down about 4%, commercial's down about 8%, industrial's down about 14%. So kind of across the board, we're down 7.3%. We did have a wetter than normal, I'll say, first couple months due to higher levels of snowfall than we do on average and did last year. So that was part of it. But then General Motors, especially on the industrial side, is down about 48%. So the water side usage has dropped way off. And so that's really the biggest driver on the water side. Just going through the revenues for February alone. Revenues are up about 11% overall. Most of it's driven through the electric side. We'll kind of get into why that is. And then on budget, they're up by about 6.6% over budget. So revenue is looking good year to date or February alone, but also as you see on the next slide, year to date. So that's perfect. So year to date, we're up about 10.8% over last year and about 8.2% over budget. So again, this is accounting type of revenue. So we usually think of cash as revenue, but cash and revenues aren't necessarily synonymous. Obviously, we bring in cash when people pay their bills, but revenue is when we book things in accounting. And so those are a little bit different from time to time. So part of that is what we're going to see here a little bit. So electric is up about 11%, and that's largely driven by wholesale sales. So we have had higher revenue numbers off of wholesale sales. That's essentially meaning we're generating more from the plants than we're consuming on site. And so therefore we're selling that to the market. So that's really driven generally by, cost prices in the marketplace, natural gas prices, generally speaking, which drive that market value. And then obviously our production of that power. So that's a good sign. Means the plants are operating well, general rule, and producing revenue above cost. And then we're seeing.
Natural gas is used to power your electric plants.
So it is used to power quite a few. So for us, natural gas powers about 20% of our overall generation. Where I'll say wind and renewables power, I'll say 45%. And then coal will handle the other piece, about 30%, generally speaking.
So the gas, is that including Dogwood?
So yes. Yeah, so that includes Dogwood and really CT4. Those are our two gas facilities, our primary gas facilities. We have a couple older fuel oil units that are, and then we have Nearman 1, which is obviously coal.
Well, it seems like, Andrew, that Nearman 1, I don't know, it seemed to me that we weren't really burning coal as much. I mean, we get that little printout.
So
Yeah, I felt like it. I don't know if it was just me.
So
It seemed like it was gas every time
You talking about
the little email that we get,
this winter?
just the past few months, it
So-
seems like.
The plant had probably the best December, January and February burning coal that we've had in
several years,
several.
at least since,
It hasn't been down, it hadn't been down as much as it had been in the past.
Well,
It's always tube leaks or there's this or unavailable.
I only
So
saw
that's
two
one
blade
piece,
once.
but the other
so.
piece is relative to the gas price and how that affects the way the units are dispatched or called into the market, right? So
that's correct. So everything has a price, right? That they have. Everything has a function in terms of what the price is and what's the ability of those plants to produce based off of the timelines that it takes to produce that.
It's been my imagination, but
Nearman comes on, pretty much stays on. You're seeing the starts and stops.
Of CT.
because it seems like it was mostly CTs.
It'll come on daily, at times. So once Nearman, typically, once it's on, it stays on. So when the.
it doesn't, you don't see all those cycles.
Okay, that's what I'm thinking.
Gas units more frequent.
Okay,
Because-
all right, then that's what I'm.
Yeah, so gas
It's
units,
set for maintenance, right now?
Right now, came off April 12th.
Yeah,
Just now. So,
okay.
Gas, oil, gas,
there's fuel oil for the
Fuel.
older units.
oil.
Fuel oil, yep,
Diesel.
basically diesel. And then coal is Nearman.
And they don't run very often.
They do not because they're the most expensive, right? So diesel is effectively more expensive than the other fuel types. Gas is generally more flexible than coal, and that's why you see it start.
It seems like I see that the most.
So yes, it has a lot more actions in terms of starts and
Okay,
stops.
all right, then,
Um,
thank you.
So
for
you would
explaining
have
that.
saw, for instance, just say January first, and it didn't happen January first, it happened sometime in December, you would have saw a start instruction from Jaren's group to the plant. Hey, at this time, bring in one to this. Well, it ran every day of January, every single day. So when you
Okay,
see those things, it's because the machine's been called for a specific period of time and then it's been called off. So the
okay,
next time it gets called on, you're gonna see another one.
okay. Because
Or you
it's
don't
usually
see that with the
something
plant when it
daily,
runs
but I
consecutive.
never
Yeah.
did ever see Nearman
Yeah,
that much.
but yes, it's been running well.
All right.
So again, wholesale sales are up. But the other thing I want to kind of point out in terms of why revenues are high is we do have the ERC over recovery from the third and fourth quarter. And the way we recognize it, the cash already hit the account, right? And so now we have to bleed that off over the next 6 months to essentially move that back to consumers. And so that is recognized each month or over the next 6 months. And so that's part of the reason from an accounting perspective that you see some of these numbers here. From an operating expenses standpoint, we are up about 23% over last year. Again, it's really, electric's up about $4 million and water's up, $100,000. And then over budget, it's about 6.9% over or about 1.5 million. So these expenses, again, are going to be tied to different activities, right? So a lot of this will be fuel expenses and those type of things that you see on that. I guess. This is operating expenses year to date. So year to date, you can see we were actually down 5.4%. So in February, we were up. In January, we were down. And so overall, we're down 5.4 year to date from last year. And we're about flat with budget. And so when you look at the 2025 budget, electric's up about 2%, water's down about 8%. And so we're about flat overall. So when we factor in depreciation and we look at year to date, the depreciation is a make-believe function of every asset lowering in value, right? If you bought a car today, tomorrow it's worth less than it was today. And so that asset goes down in value. And so it really looks very similar to the operating expenses piece. So again, down year to date, about 6.2%, down about 0.4% versus budget. But really the big driver on the expense side, as we mentioned, is fuel. And that's really driven by the plants operating more. So, right. So everything costs money to make money. So every time Nearman operates, it's costing, $25-ish to run by burning fuel. And then we sell that into the market for some value greater than $25. So we put some offer curve in there and the market dispatches you based off that offer curve. And so as long as you're making money, they will dispatch you to do that. And so that's kind of how that works. But on the flip side of that is purchase power. So purchase power is effectively when we're going out and buying market energy to serve our load, right? So if market prices were below, for example, our offers or Nearman's offer cost, right? They came in at say $15, for example, overnight. We would buy that from the marketplace because it would be cheaper than running your own unit, right? So we do that. That's a constant thing all day, every day. So we're buying and we're selling. But generally speaking, we have purchased more in the past. But again, that's really contingent on what those market costs are and therefore whether the units operate more or less. So that's really what drives that.
Now, but then we said that we made money on the wholesale sales.
Right.
because we sold more,
We do.
because we produced more.
Yes, that's right. So when we have to buy, we have to essentially either buy or make enough power to serve our load, right? So we have a load cost that we get encountered into these expenses, right? That you don't necessarily see. So it's not just, am I buying or selling to zero? I'm buying or selling against whatever my costs are to serve all of our customers, right? So that's why you see that fuel cost being 9.2 and I'll say the wholesale sales piece being 4 million or 5 million, whatever that number was, right? So there's an inherent cost of some number. Generally speaking, it's $3 to $8 million a month for the load costs. So depending on what market prices are, those are costs that we have to serve that load no matter what. And that's why we have retail rates to make up for that cost. And the market is generally just not sufficient for a generator to make enough money to be sufficient to cover its cost in the marketplace itself, because the markets just generally don't have enough margins built in. So that all ended 20 years ago when those third-party players exited some of that space. And now it's really generally load-serving entities that have all that generation, unless you're doing it for RECs or some other purpose. So
And so a load serving entity
is anybody like us, anybody that has retail customers, right? So we're required to have essentially generation to meet those responsibilities, right? So we have to have, I'll say 116% in the summer, 136% of that capability in the winter. We don't have the ability to say, hey, I'm just going to buy everything on the market. If everybody said that, nobody'd be producing anything and you couldn't buy anything, right? So the markets are really intended to say, they're a reliability mechanism so that all of us can serve our load, and therefore we all have to participate in that space versus just saying, hey, somebody else make it and I'll pay $20 for that power. It doesn't work that way because there's just not enough money in the markets. ERCOT operates a little bit differently. And so they don't do the exact same things that we do in SPP, but it does cause a lot more volatility in ERCOT. And that's why you see some of these really spiky prices in ERCOT, because they don't have some of the same requirements in terms of how much resource adequacy we carry. So
ERCOT's Texas.
yeah, ERCOT is just Texas. It doesn't leave the state of Texas, it's just Texas alone. So we operate more similar to what MISO does, which is Iowa, Illinois, some of that area over there. And then there's PJM a little bit further east. So all of us operate in somewhat of a similar fashion. ERCOT operates just a little bit uniquely, so. Changing that position. So changing that position is really, how much did our assets move versus our liabilities or costs move? And so this, again, isn't tied to cash specifically, right? It's just a change in net position. So if you, for example, took $500 and bought a laptop, your net position didn't change. You have an asset now worth $500 and you now took away $500 asset in cash.
Less depreciation.
And then tomorrow it's worth less, right? Because you have depreciation. So that's kind of how that change in net position works. And so it's not a true cash position. And so when you gauge yourself on cash, you can see things differently than when you gauge it from an accounting perspective, say. So for the month of February, for example, we didn't climb as much as we did in February 2024, but year to date, we're doing really well. So on the next slide, please. So year to date, we're up 11.26 versus last year 2.4. And again, this isn't a cash position, and so we'll get into cash a little bit, but this is really just assets and liabilities talking as a general rule. Next slide, please. These slides are, I'm not sure if they're a ton of value, but we kept them in here for now until we reevaluate what we do. But this is really just showing electric revenues versus expenses for the month of February. And so generally what you'll see on the trend line is that revenues exceed operating and non-operating expenses, which is the nature of how business works, is that you've got to be taking in as much money as you spend, otherwise you're not going to be operating very long. And so this trend line just proves that we are doing exactly that and that it's really relatively stable in terms of year to year, what we're doing. On the water side, a very similar picture. Revenues are exceeding expenses. Again, what we would expect that going forward. So the average daily collections numbers, again, that's what we bring in on an average day across those various months. And this really follows, again, this is electric and water both, but it follows a very similar trend line generally to the electric side because that's where the bulk of the revenues come from. And so the bulk of the revenues come in those last several months, the 8, 9, 10 months. And that's really driven by that summer air conditioning load, right? So as you use consumption in the summer months, we start collecting that in month 8, 9, and 10. That's kind of where that comes, just because we collectively use more air conditioning load than we would on a heating load, for example. In terms of the cash position, and so this is a gauge that we use to look at how well are we holding cash and acquiring cash. And so again, generally the first half of the month or first half of the year is generally net negative. And that's because we're generally spending more money than we're receiving, and that's because loads are lower, those type of things. And so you see for the first 2 months, we're down about 3.5 million. That's less than we've seen over the last 2 years. In March, since we already know the numbers in March, we are up about 581,000. So we will see a slight positive in March, which again is relatively typical. But we would expect probably slight fall in cash over the next few months as we start spending on projects and don't have a lot of revenue because of lower loads.
The other thing that happens January, February, March, everybody gets their new budget. So POs are issued, parts, pieces, machinery, fleet, all those things are maybe ordered in the fourth quarter of the previous year and they hit December, January, February, and they've got to be paid for. So that's a little bit of, on top of the revenue being down because of the seasonal nature of it, the business process part of it also kind of kicks us January, February, March a little bit.
Yeah, and a lot of the reoccurring expenses are incurred in the really January, February timeframe, just because that's when those things reissue. So this is really typical. This is typically what we see on other people's books as well. So again, it's based off of generally the revenues are created generally in the 6, 7, 8 months. So that's what we expect. So no negative news here. It's looks fine at this date. And so we'll see kind of where we sit today. And so next slide, please. Thank you. So we're about 73.37 million. Last month we were at 75.39. Again, we dropped 6 days by that drop in cash there. Still in a good position overall, 122. As of last year, we were at 80 days. So well better than last year. Some of it is if you look down below, the fuel inventory piece is last year we had about 10.4 million in fuel inventory. That's fuel on the ground, predominantly coal. Whereas February 2025, we only have 4.7 million. So that's quite a bit different. And so that obviously is not cash, but it's an asset. So it's that type of thing. And so we will build up coal inventory over the next 2 months as we are working through the outage piece, and then we'll start burning it through the summer months and start decreasing that quantity as well. So, but we did carry more in 2024 than we typically do. And that's some of that's due to softer run times in 2024. So the next slide is
They softer run times than
just less amounts, less run. So in 24 and really in 23, natural gas prices were averaging 2, even sometimes south of 2. Whereas in 2022, for example, they averaged over $6 a decatherm for natural gas. And so we're really competitive at about $2.50 gas. And so anytime it gets below that number, coal becomes less competitive. anytime it gets above that number, we become really competitive. So the higher natural gas prices, the more coal becomes competitive. And so right now, we're looking at likely $4 natural gas for 2025. So that means coal will likely be very competitive this year, means likely high run times this year. And everything the EIA is predicting thus far is showing natural gas prices to just marginally increase going forward. So assuming we don't have another pullback into the low twos or sub twos, we expect coal to remain competitive going forward. So
At one point in time, Southwest Power Pool were pushing, it seemed like they were pushing the wind and solar, even though they were more expensive.
so
How does that,
So-
how are we competitive when they're,
there's obviously a lot of moving pieces, right? And so there's tax credit components associated with the wind and solar type of facilities. And so therefore, they get some value there. And most of that is production tax credit, which means it's based on running. And so obviously, if it's running, the cost to operate a wind facility, we'll say, is, we generally consider it at zero, right? So the fuel cost is zero. But generally speaking, there's a capital cost to build all those facilities, right? And so we generally pay the developer the capital cost, essentially divided across the number of megawatt hours that they believe they're going to operate. And so really the challenge with, I'll say wind particularly, because we're really in a wind state predominantly, although we will see solar start picking up, is there is so much wind and it's located in areas where there is not a lot of load. And so therefore there's too much congestion in those areas to produce enough power that can be distributed across load centers. And so therefore, the value that wind produces, the value of that power is really, really low, right? So we get paid very small amounts for our wind production, and our cost is a fixed cost per megawatt hour. And so generally, the market isn't sufficient to pay us for the cost of that. And that's, again, it's not good nor bad, but that's kind of the way it works. And so,
But it's not a free energy source.
Amen.
So we hear that a lot is, oh,
Yeah.
we get this free sun and we've got this free wind. Well, all of these developers that build the turbines and the transmission lines and the inverters and all the things aren't doing it out of the goodwill of their heart
Man.
to just turn over. And so they have to recover all of that money, right? And so that gets built into, this cost of getting the energy here and all that.
And they have to maintain them and they have to.
yeah, so like everything, there's a giant cost to it.
now, does SPP get the tax credits in that, or do we participate in those tax credits that you were talking about?
So SPP really, I'll say, has no dog in the fight, so they get no tax credit, none of that. So that is all the developers keep all of that. So they own it, they would take the tax credit. So we bought several projects from Enel and some different providers, but they will take the tax credits on their side. And they will, again, give us a purchase power agreement price. So we have essentially a fixed price for, generally speaking, for a 20-year arrangement. And that's how they recoup a portion of their capital costs, right? So it costs X dollars, plus they get the tax credit piece. And so their investment is Y. It's really, so the SPP's piece in all of that is SPP credits generating assets. And so therefore, they, along with all of us participants, determine what the accreditation value of those resources are. And so today, for example, up through 2025, generally speaking, on my wind assets, I'm getting somewhere between 50 and 60% accreditation value on that wind asset.
So if we need 100 megawatts, we have to purchase.
Right. So you would have to purchase, 160 megawatts or thereabouts to get that 100 megawatts of capacity accreditation. That is today through 2025, beginning in 2026. And so this is where SPP's challenge begins, is there's been such an influx of wind predominantly that therefore all these RTOs are concerned about the reliability aspects of having one fuel source dominate so much that they can't meet those, I'll say, those times when it becomes critical for power, right? The really cold times, the really hot times. Wind is generally a shoulder month time and overnight period producer. And so what they're doing on the effective load carrying capability piece, is just a terminology piece, is they're going to drop that value down to 12 to 20% accreditation level. So we're sitting at 60 and we're gonna fall somewhere between 12 and 20 starting next year, right? So that's megawatts that you still control and you do exactly the same thing next year that we do this year, but it's going to be worth, I'll say 40% less than it is worth now. And so therefore you have to go get another asset to make up that 40% shortfall that you have, right? So that's gonna happen for wind. Solar is going to have something similar, but solar, there is so little solar in the SPP footprint today that it has a higher value. And solar is going to be different. It's going to have a higher value in the summertime and a lower value in the wintertime because it's cloudier, it's not as bright out. Thermal has a similar approach, although it's based off of its reliability in these summer and winter periods. So it's going to have a different mechanism, but we're going to get haircuts across all of our fleet, just greatest on the wind assets. And therefore, we're going to have to make up that shortfall through other avenues. And so that'll either be acquiring other generating assets or something along those lines. So that's what we're looking at. We're in a pretty good position today with our current load that we have today. But everybody is going to be short really quickly. All the load serving entities will become short really quickly. And so the market for capacity has really ballooned. In PJM, for example, it's climbed eightfold in the last year. We're seeing something similar here, not quite as drastic, but pretty drastic. And so we're seeing plenty of paper capacity, which means no energy associated with it. We're seeing plenty of deals for 5 to 10 year deals that are $8+ a kW. And again, a year ago, we would have sold some of that probably for $1 or $1.50. So it is changing drastically, but that's the world we live in.
Understatement.
So
Question, have we ever thought about nuclear?
So nuclear is always a topic for sure. It's all over the place. So there has been very little nuclear build out in the entire United States. The last build out was Vogtle in the Southeast. It went through, don't quote me, but I believe 27 cost overruns. So permitting is really difficult. It's really between the government and the builders, they have struggled to put a process in place that works effectively and efficiently. So the United States just hasn't built nuclear. We're seeing a lot of talk about small modular reactors. Those are the smaller reactors, generally in the 300 megawatt range, which makes more sense for us, I'll say, with our load today. But we haven't seen anything built. Nothing's been, I'll say, actively moved to the next designation. So we'll continue to watch nuclear. The nice thing with it is it operates and it may not have a downtime for 3 years. It'll just operate flat, full load for 3 years before it even comes offline. So it is a pretty valuable resource. Again, a few years ago when capacity prices were really low, lots of nukes were starting to close because there wasn't enough value. They're really expensive to operate and maintain because it requires so many people, all of these type of things. But now that capacity values have shot up, the value of nukes is drastically improved. And we've seen a whole bunch of nukes get brought back online, really driven by data center load type stuff. But most of the nukes that have closed over the last handful of years are starting to reopen now. So that's an interesting change. We haven't seen that before, so. Again, on the cash piece, we did fall. You can see again where our reserve tried to maintain is 120 days. We're right about that number now. And so we're doing a pretty good job where we're at, but we will probably bleed a little bit more over the next handful of months before we pick up additional cash. But we're in a really good position, relatively speaking. From a capital spending perspective, we are higher than last year, 7 million versus 2.5. But we do still have 88% of that remaining budget left. So we got plenty of space. Generally speaking, the capital spend speeds up during the warmer months when the people are out working, but we're in a good position there. So no concerns immediately, at least. Then the debt coverage. The debt coverage is really just net operating income over debt service. So this is really one of those things that we need for, I'll say, as we talk about debt service and bonds, this is what they require us to carry to make sure that we're sufficiently able to pay that debt that we oblige ourselves to. And so right now, including pilot, we try to maintain a target of 2.0 times. We're at 3.19 times, which is a really solid number. Much better than last year at 2.52. So we're in good shape there. Excluding pilot, we try to maintain 1.6 times. We're at 2.45 overall compared to 1.8 last year. And so we're in a really good position with our debt today. Obviously, we haven't issued since 2020. So we continue to pay down principal, and therefore these numbers just continue to improve until we reissue new debt. So we're in a good place there. And that's all I got on the financials.
Andrew, one thing I wanted to discuss is you're not locked into this format. And so
I know.
you can make your format yours and
So I think we will, so we're getting through the audit now, and so accounting is really occupied with that stuff, but I do anticipate, I'll say, maybe early summer, sitting down with them and potentially sitting down with you guys and making sure that we're all comfortable with where we want it to look like. And so I want to get it to a place where, one, it can be consistent, but two, that it's helpful for all of us to see and make
Right.
decisions on and at least know where we're at and where we're going. So we will revisit that this year. And so there'll be several slides, I think, that we'll change around and do some things different, but no, I appreciate that.
yeah, I wanted to make sure that was part
Before
of
we,
the
before we
discussion
went to
today.
this, we had the spreadsheets. I mean,
Yes, well, and that's where it needs to be something where you guys can see it and understand it
Yeah.
and make sense of it versus, like you said, a spreadsheet that has 412 numbers in different places and you're like, where does this tie to? What is it? So.
Yeah.
I get that. Clearly a little bit windy on that.
now, as far as like this committee goes in finance committee. If I'm not mistaken, we decided or talked about, we would meet, like in the off two or 3 months and then quarterly, then we would go before the full board, not on the consent agenda. Is that?
We had discussed that and
And I think it works for me and it makes sense to me that, at least on a quarterly basis that, we present to the full board, but I am open to whatever you guys.
I think that's what we did,
well, Andrew and I had discussed that too. I couldn't remember if we all discussed that together.
That's what was in the original discussion of changing the meeting formats was consent agenda, resume regular cadence of the finance committee meetings, but then big presentations quarterly.
Yeah,
And quarterly might mean though, not until he has the March
Right, yeah.
information, right?
Yeah.
So.
Right.
right.
Now, we voted on, there's time, we vote to approve the financials. Would we do that on a quarterly basis?
We do.
Monthly in your
The
consent.
consent agenda, yeah, it's in the consent agenda,
Okay,
so.
Yes. So,
Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
yeah.
This meeting is just to try to feel out
Yeah.
what we need from Andrew, and
Yeah.
his method of presentation is up to him.
And I think the other sort of educational piece is good for all of us as a refresher. And,
Right.
Yeah, I hope.
something different that hasn't been introduced to the committee meetings before. And so hopefully you find value in it.
Yeah, I was kind of going into this blind because this is a new situation for me too, to
Well, and I,
financials to be on the consent agenda, and then how do we really cover them so that everybody's understanding everything.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, so this presentation is really hopefully just kind of educational. It's pretty high level for the most part, but it's really, again, debt is very important, right? And we have a sizable debt position. And it's important for utilities and municipalities in general to utilize debt to finance those structures. And so the more everybody understands about what goes into that and why certain thresholds are important, and we'll talk about some credit rating stuff probably at another meeting, but they all intertwine. And why do we need cash balances? Why do we need these certain things? And how do they play into the aspects that we go about? And so those are all things that, I just want to make sure that we all kind of understand, because it is a big picture of all these different things that play into why we do what we do and how everything functions and what makes it best, right? So there's no perfect answer. It's all what makes the most sense for us on I'll say debt and those type of avenues. So yeah, on the first slide, please. Good. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is really just an introduction to utility debt in general. So municipalities, so cities, they often issue bonds to finance infrastructure projects, right? We do it, the city does it. It's really to pay for assets that are long life assets that are very expensive. So municipal government entities generally issue GO or general obligation bonds. These bonds are generally contain an obligation backed by the taxing authority. So therefore, the city has a bond that they sell, and those are general obligation bonds. And so therefore, people trust in those bonds because the city has the ability to tax you, property tax, those type of things, to return that revenue, that cost, the money that those bond investors are putting out. Electric and water utilities generally issue revenue bonds. So these bonds are generally contain an obligation backed by the revenue of the utility. So, right, we get to set rates, you guys set rates, and therefore those rates are what drive our ability to pay back these bonds, right? So the reason we get the rates we get is because credit rating agencies and therefore the investors believe that you're going to do what you need to do to pay back those bonds. And therefore you will do what you need to do on rates to make sure that those bonds are paid back. And so we issue slightly different bonds, generally speaking, than the city would issue. Again, ours are revenue, theirs are general obligation.
Is our debt included in this UG's debt? When they say that they're $1 billion in debt, does that include our debt too?
Yes, it likely, and I haven't, it's been a while since I've seen their debt, but technically they are responsible for all of the debt because we were going to go there to ask them. So I haven't seen their numbers. So I'd have to go back and check.
I think when that was all percolating, I think our debt was included in those numbers. I mean, I think that's what I heard.
So I haven't seen the, I'll say the report or whatever somebody's referencing. But we kind of talked about, our debt here. So we have about likely somewhere around 570 million for our own personal debt. I think can't recall exactly, but I was thinking they were closer to 800, but
Something, I would almost say that when they caveat that, might not be right, but when they report their 800 and some number, I can't believe that includes ours.
I don't think so, because
That's what I was wondering because
they're separate budgets. And so for them to include our debt, it's kind of.
They're the sponsor of ours,
Right.
but it technically, I think, gets applied against our assets, our revenues.
right. So yes, and that's why we issue revenue bonds and they issue GO bonds. And so, yeah, so we carry the debt, I'll say KPI, to make sure that we're responsible and we're paying that debt. So go ahead.
But you're talking about infrastructure though, right? Not just bonds in general, you're talking about infrastructure.
So our debt is generally, and we'll get into that a little bit in terms of what we do, but generally it's based on infrastructure projects, right? That's generally what we invest in. So transmission, distribution, power plants, water facilities, those type of things are generally what we're doing because it needs to be assets that are long enough life and that are expensive enough that you don't want to cash finance those and pay for those directly. And it's really meant, debt is really meant to ensure that the people who are paying for those assets are the ones that are utilizing those assets, right? So you don't want to pay for a full price of a power plant today, when over the next 50 years, that asset's going to be utilized each step of the way by those customers during that lifespan. So, and so really bond financing spreads that cost out over time, right? So it doesn't take a giant increase in rates today to pay for something big. And so it really allows urgent upgrades without that immediate rate hike. So again, some of the typical tools, the revenue bonds, the general obligation bonds. We also have KDHE state revolving loan funds, and those are really backed by an insurance policy. So they're a little bit different, but water utilizes KDHE loans quite a bit because they're really low interest rate, flexible, easier. And so we do utilize KDHE loans quite a bit.
Andrew, they also made those more attractive. They used to be 20-year notes. Now they're 30-year notes, the last couple of times that the bonds. Yeah, so that's really a lot better for us too.
Yeah, again, and we're generally talking about long-lived assets, right? So that makes more sense that it reaches that longer term space because it's covering an asset that's going to probably live that space. Some of the pros is, again, infrastructure is capital intensive long-term, bond financing spreads cost over time. And we typically have access to lower interest rates. So being a municipality, we have tax exempt debt today. We'll see what happens in 2025. That is one of the topics of conversation at the federal level. But today, really all the stuff you see, most of the bridges and power plants and these type of things that are by municipalities are all tax exempt debt financing. So most of the projects you've seen in the country get built are really tax exempt debt. And so that's something we'll push really hard for, that I'll say APPA and those type of entities will push really hard for, because it is a value to us to have that tax exempt status. Because really the people who buy tax exempt status bonds are those that pay really high tax levels, right? So wealthier individuals, so forth, that are in that, I'll say 25 to 40% tax brackets, it's more valuable to them, and therefore they will pay a lower coupon rate to us than they would a taxable entity like a Microsoft or somebody else that we're competing against. So it makes it really attractive for us to issue debt. Some of the cons are it does increase long-term liabilities, but that's what it is, right? It's spreading that cost out over time. So you do have to be careful about the way you go about issuing debt. You don't want to issue so much debt that you cannot then cover it, those type of things. And so we do have to make sure that we have a solid financial plan, capital plan to make sure that can be funded without, again, major hurdles that come up that require you guys to take large action in terms of rates and these type of things, because we're not prepared for what's coming. And so, and then it can impact the credit rating depending on how much debt you issue. And again, there's a lot of things that impact the credit rating, and we'll talk about that over time. But, you know, our community impacts that, the days of cash we have impact that. Your ability to, I'll say, increase rates when rates are needed to be increased, those type of things. So some of it is governance. All of those things matter to those rating agencies that say, we believe that you guys will do what is necessary to ensure that this debt is covered. So those are all important things. Some of the examples of the debt in utilities is, again, infrastructure upgrades, aging grids, substation, transmission lines, regulatory compliance. We did this kind of on the Nearman facility when we had to issue that debt. Pipeline replacement, a lot of water pipeline, water treatment plants, those type of things. Those are all examples of what we might issue debt for, because they're all, again, long-lived assets that are very expensive. Next slide, please. So here's kind of, I'll say, a run through of our current debt issuances that we have. And so you can see it all ranges from 2014 to 2020. So in 2020, we refunded a lot of issues. So you can kind of see there in 2020A that we refunded 2010, 2011, 2012 issuances. And that was really to take advantage of the lower coupon rate. So you can see that 2020A we got a coupon rate of about 2.2%. And so that's pretty attractive debt rating or debt cost. And so that's why we refunded. And so as we look forward, we'll continue to explore opportunities to refund debt if we can get lower rates on any of that stuff. Rates are a little bit higher now, but they're trending in the right direction, I believe. And so I think we'll see some of that opportunity come forward, assuming that say tax exempt debt exists here in the next 6 months. And so we'll continue to do that. Some of the information that's not on here today is we do have the KDHE loan. It says varies up there, and that's because we take out loans from time to time. So it's not a single loan that we have, and that's done in a little bit different process. I think we have about 54.6 million outstanding on that today. And then that UG radio, that's a debt that the unified government took out that we have agreed to pay a portion for. And that is really tied to the EMS system or the radio system along with the Leavenworth Road T&D project. And so we have about 2.7 million, I think, outstanding of that project there itself.
So Andrew, is 4.3 the highest interest rate we're paying on any of our?
It is today. Yep. Yeah. And so again, that's the value of tax exempt financing, right? And so if we were taxable, we would see that probably climb by 25 to 35% at least.
Exactly.
And so that's a real value to us and really the consumers because they're the ones who are going to have to pay for it. So.
And so what determines like the refunding, the percentage you're getting when you do that? How's that?
So it's really based off of, so there's rules within each issuance in terms of when you can refund. So they're not all exactly the same. But when we go issue a refund of a debt, effectively what we'll do is we'll pay for that debt, right? So we'll essentially call that debt and pay what's outstanding of that debt.
Right.
But we would issue that debt probably plus more debt if we were looking to do it because there's cost to all this stuff. But we would then take a lower coupon than the debt that we had before. So take your 4.3 coupon that you see there.
Right.
Is we would potentially look to refund that opportunity when we got the chance, if we could get, sub 4.3, right? And so therefore, now I'm still paying the same exact, I'll say payment, for example, but I'm now paying more principal or paying a
Okay.
lower payment, right? So
Okay.
there's a lot of things it's the same way as when you look at refinancing your mortgage, for
It's the
example,
same
same exact thing as
Issue. Okay.
if somebody offers you a 2% and you have a 4% note, you're like, hey, it makes sense. There is cost, right?
Exactly.
There's several $100,000 that go into issuing debt because you got to pay the advisors and the attorneys and everybody else. But generally speaking, we issue pretty large debt pieces and therefore those become fractions of percentages in terms of the overall cost of that issuance. So.
Now, the funds that are used to pay back this debt, does that have any impact on anything like environmental surcharge, like the air quality control? That we have a surcharge and we collect money, and does that money then go to pay off those bonds?
So yes, so that piece, the ESC, that is a rider that we put in place on the rates themselves that goes directly back to pay for that debt specifically. And so we know that we cover 1.3 times that debt every year. And so all of us pick up a tab of $1 per month or whatever that number is, so that debt is covered directly through a rider, right? Everything else, all the other debts are covered through just the revenue that comes in and we pay that out. But we set a specific rider for that one because it was such a large dollar, such a large investment. And therefore, we're capturing that over time through the rates themselves directly.
Smart. If it weren't done that way, you would have one of those more aggressive rate adjustments put in front of the board. right?
Yeah. Yeah, so.
Pretty reasonable.
And so this is really just a graph showing how we've structured and what we've layered our debt today. And so it's really to try to keep it relatively consistent so that we don't see big swings in payment requirements. And so you can kind of see out through, the early 2030 period before our debt starts falling off. And so we'll kind of look into, again, what we need to do and so forth. But we want to make sure that we make this as smooth as possible. And so we can shape the way our debt looks, right? We can take interest only for several years and then add principal to it, depending on the shape of our total existing debt. So we can move these things around to make sure that we fit what we're trying to do and not have some big payment amount coming next year, for example, where you're gonna have to figure out how to fund it, right? So we've structured it really smoothly and cleanly to make sure that we don't have any major surprises, or I'll say big increases in costs. And it's efficient, it is. So really quick, just want to go through the high level process, because this is kind of really what we're going to do if we go through the debt process. We identify projects, and this is an internal project where we're identifying what projects need to be done, what are the lifespans, do we have the revenues to meet that, do the feasibility studies. And then we really come to the approval process, and that's really when staff presents to you, the BPU board, to see if you're acceptable of that debt issuance and those projects that we're trying to put forward. And then if you guys approve that, we go to the unified government and present to the unified government on this debt issuance. And again, it
Because
gets,
remember, they're the sponsor.
yep. So we need them to sign off on our debt. And so again, hopefully they see it the same way, but hopefully we educate them well in advance of what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. Then we really get into the financial advising and bond structuring. And this is where we interact with the financial advisor to make sure, we look at the amount, the interest rates, maturities, structure of the bonds. And again, usually by revenues is what we do. And they look at, and credit rating agencies also are engaged at that time. And so just for your reference, we currently sit at A for Fitch and S&P and A2 for Moody's. That's essentially high middle is what you generally consider those ratings. So we're in a pretty good position overall. Obviously, the higher you are, the cheaper the interest rate overall is because you're a lower credit risk. But we're in a really solid position today in terms of where we sit. So
Is our credit rating affected by the UG credit?
it is likely have some influence because it is influenced by all of those things, but the debt is really our obligation. And so the things that weigh the most are your community attributes, your cash position, your ability to pay, and then governance. And so all of those things we've improved over the last, I'll say 12 months, honestly. And so those all have a structure. But our community is a challenge because it's based on, wealth within the community. But we're doing a really good job and we're sitting in a really good position in terms of where we sit, in terms of what Moody's views. I'll say Moody's and Fitch and S&P all view. So yeah, we're in pretty good shape there. So
I believe that if there came a time where they thought they might have to pay our debt, they probably would cry, screaming and kicking and screaming.
yes, yes,
No way.
yes. And that's why we issue revenue debt, generally speaking, versus general obligation bonds. That would be on the taxable authority. So then we go through a legal and regulatory compliance. That's when we really bring in the legal counsel. We start preparing the bond prospectus and official statements, those type of things.
In my time, I don't think that we've ever gone before the UG and asked, and they refused.
They never refused.
I've never heard, I don't think.
And so I think it'll be interesting. And I think it'll be an educational process that we need to make sure that we're fulfilling. And
These times are changing.
It's
Yeah, that's why it's
different.
good to have a good
It's
relationship.
a different
Yeah.
time now
Not in
too.
there,
Yeah.
yeah, and so then we sell the bonds, and we generally do it either through public offering or private placement. Private placement is where generally one investor will buy the entire offer. But public offering is where you would sell it to lots and lots of bond buyers, right? So we would look at both of those options. And
Yeah, like Mary.
yes, so there could be a private.
Well, people like to buy bonds because they're usually,
Tax free?
well, it's usually a very, municipal bonds are, but it's usually a very solid investment.
Right, and again, we're an A2, so we're a very solid investment. And then we start the construction process, and then we pay it over 25 to 30 years. And that's, again, my conclusion really is we use them, they're really important, they have value to the organization, and creditworthiness is really important. And so we'll kind of talk about that upcoming session, but that's all I got.
So where do we stand with a utility about our size, a municipal
So
in debt? Are we about the same? We are about
we,
where everybody
so
is?
you've seen where we're at on the debt KPI. We're in a really good position, actually. We're in a really good position. And so I'd say we're better than, slightly better than average. And that's because we've improved our debt position over the last few years by paying debt and not issuing debt. So we're
Yeah.
slightly better than
A
average.
lot better than it used to be.
To Stevie's point about the relationship and all these approvals, that's why we're here tonight at 6 o'clock, right? Is so that we shepherd this thing through kind of the right way, because ultimately at the end of the day, if some of these things come to fruition this year and into next year and 2 and 3 out years, we're going to be sitting here saying, we've got these things we need to invest in. And so taking the time, I know you've seen the information you're going to see later here in a few minutes, but it's really just to get you a better look at it, let you ask some questions. You're better prepared to answer those questions and strengthen that relationship over there should we have to. You know, we still ultimately need them to approve the thing, right?
That's
So
right.
the relationship piece is important.
Well, and usually I'm just looking at our debt as on one little piece of paper. So this is important, I feel like, and it's good information. I appreciate it.
Good, thank you.